Piers Robinson, PhD, has 20 years of experience researching and teaching in academia, including as professor in politics, society, and political journalism at the University of Sheffield from 2016 to 2019. He is currently research director at the International Center for 9/11 Justice and co-editor of both the Journal of 9/11 Studies and Propaganda in Focus. He continues to research and publish on propaganda and international politics. Thank you, Piers.
Thank you. Okay, I'd like to thank you for that kind introduction, Madhava, and thank you everyone for holding out. It's getting late. I will add that I'm on German time. I flew over from Berlin yesterday, so if you think you've got it bad, it's 3 o'clock in the morning for me. So today I'm going to be giving a short talk into one specific area of IC 911's research into the 9/11 flights. It's our flight simulator study. And this forms part of a wider research project or wider research agenda that we have set up in order to explore all of the aviation aspects surrounding 9/11. Now, I want to emphasize at the outset that these insights I'm going to be discussing today are preliminary and subject to further research and analysis. There is more work to be done. And I will make sure to flag up some of the uncertainties and limitations at the end of the presentation. But I do hope, however, to give you an idea of roughly where we are in terms of our understanding of the 9/11 flights that we've been looking at. Before we go into the details, however, I want to provide some context for the wider audience, particularly the wider audience out there on the live stream, and thank you to Redacted for that. To the wider audience out there, to give them an understanding of why it is we are so interested in looking at the 9/11 flights. And in order to do that, I think it's worth just recapping the core narrative on 9/11, or the so-called official story regarding 9/11. And that is, it goes as follows. On September the 11th, 2001, a group of terrorists commandeered 4 airliners and succeeded in flying 2 of them into the Twin Towers, World Trade Center 1 and World Trade Center 2, leading to their complete destruction. Now, we understand, and we've seen a lot of presentations today which show this, but we understand through extensive research which has been carried out by the 9/11 research community that the complete destruction of these buildings could not have been achieved from the aircraft impacts alone. That the most likely plausible explanation for what happened is controlled demolition of these towers, which was pre-planned and carefully set up well before the plane impacts. Bottom line is that the evidence points clearly towards controlled demolition of these buildings, and I think that's where we are in terms of the state of knowledge regarding the building destruction. But how did the planners, ensure that the aircraft were flown into the buildings? Without this goal being achieved, a key component of the narrative would have effectively failed. Put simply, if the planes had failed to hit the targets, the deliberate and planned destruction of these buildings would have become obvious, or it would not have been able to happen at all, because the planes formed an essential part of the cover story for the complete destruction of these buildings. And it's here that over the years, a number of arguments have emerged or have been advanced, which suggests it would have been extremely unlikely for the planners of 9/11 to have relied upon the alleged terrorists successfully taking over or commandeering the aircraft and then flying them into the targets. So what are these arguments? I'm going to run through the 4 main ones which have emerged over time. First of all, one set of arguments has emerged over essentially the performance limitations of the aircraft in question at the speeds that they were flying at, which was in excess of 500 knots. And the argument here is that, structurally, the aircraft would have suffered from a range of aerodynamic effects, including flutter, Mach tuck, Dutch roll, which would have essentially, or even engine flame out, which would have essentially prevented them from reaching the targets. The planes, some people argue, would have broken up at that speed and at that altitude. Another set of arguments is that the forced takeover of these planes would have been extremely difficult to pull off successfully in one case, let alone 4 cases. And Ted Walter's presentation last year in the Aviation Symposium went through the history of attempts to commandeer airliners. And the history shows that they normally fail. Flight crews fight back. It's a difficult thing to pull off, to achieve. Another argument, and this is getting closer to the core sort of focus or research question that we have with the flight simulator study that we set up, is that the experience levels of the alleged terrorists were simply insufficient for it to allow them to successfully take over the airliners and navigate them and then fly them into the target. And this is a sort of a fairly, a lot of you will be familiar with this argument, but it's been pointed out that sort of Hani Hanjour, for example, who allegedly flew AA-77 into the Pentagon, had failed a couple of check rides, unable to hire a Cessna, that he at most had a commercial pilot's license with really a couple hundred hours experience and very little time in a simulator. And so the argument goes that these people who were apparently trained up on Cessnas possibly had a CPL, that they simply wouldn't have had the ability to transition to flying a big wide-body jet and handling it and navigating it. And there's a further argument which is developed on this, which is essentially the flyability of the maneuvers, not just a question of these low experienced pilots trying to fly these planes, but the idea that the maneuvers themselves, which we see on 9/11, would have been extremely difficult from a point of view of hand-eye coordination and judgment required in order for them to be completed successfully. And some people argue, and Dan Hanley, for example, puts forward this argument, that he, as a highly experienced pilot, would have been unable to fly the maneuvers that you see on 9/11. So this is the idea that actually it's not even a question of a low experienced pilot. Even a high experienced pilot would be unable to carry out these maneuvers. Now, all of this has really coalesced around, in a sense, an argument over manual control versus automated control of the flights. That if these planes could not have been flown manually, then it's starting to point towards some kind of automated system. And so Dan Hanley talks about the continuous uninterrupted autopilot. Aidan Monahan has looked into various mechanisms which might have been used in order to automatically control the planes, guide them into the targets. And it's the question of the flyability of these maneuvers and of the experience levels of the pilots, which is the focus of the flight simulator study, which we've been conducting over the last 6 months. The C&D is essentially the research focus. Just to be clear, so what we've been trying to do with our flight simulator study is to assess the difficulty involved with the manual control of the 9/11 flights and the probability of the flight profiles being flown by the individuals alleged to have commandeered the aircraft. And to be very clear, we're not looking at the question of whether these aircraft were capable in aerodynamic terms of flying these routes. That's not a question we're addressing. Nor are we addressing the question of whether the planes which flew into the buildings on 9/11 were the actual registered aircraft which authorities claim them to be. And we're not looking at the question of the presence or absence of the planes. Those are other questions which have to be answered in different ways. We're looking at the specific question of the flyability of these planes by the purported hijackers or terrorists. Okay, let's just run through the research steps. So in the first instance, we've focused on United Airlines Flight 175, which flew into the South Tower, and then looking at American Airlines 77, which purportedly went into the Pentagon. In order to do this, we've used a full motion 737 simulator, and I'll be showing you some excerpts from that in the course of the presentation. And we've drawn upon 3 highly experienced airline transport license qualified pilots, 2 of whom are former fast jet pilots. So we've been using experienced pilots for the first stage of this study. Now, in initial evaluations, which involved myself and the two former Air Force pilots, it became it became apparent reasonably quickly that the basic challenge of pointing the aircraft at the target and hitting it was relatively straightforward to achieve. And we dubbed this, in terms of the research design, the lenient test of the official narrative regarding the 9/11 flights. What did pose a challenge, however, was flying the actual routes that were observed on the day. And I'll give you more on this in a minute. And we dubbed this the stringent test of the official narrative. So research focusing on a stringent test whereby the pilots that we recruited were tasked with flying the actual maneuvers purportedly flown. We also gathered information during the stage 1 tests of the lenient test and how easily that could be performed as well. Okay, let's talk more closely, or let's get into this question of these complex flight profiles which were flown. I'll take a risk here. I'm going to use the pointer. Okay, so we'll start with Flight 175. Okay, this is, I think, this is the flight track provided by National Transportation Safety Board, and you have the aircraft around about here is the time, according to the official narrative, the aircraft was commandeered or taken over by the alleged hijackers. It then continued flying southwest for a period of time, then it turned south, and then onto southeasterly course before turning onto a heading of about, I think it was about 50, 60 degrees, taking it into lower Manhattan, where, and there's a picture there of the 767 just a split second before it impacts the South Tower. So that's the flight path according to the official narrative. This is getting a bit more detail in the profile. Again, I'm trying to give a sense, or I'm trying to detail the specific maneuvers which were actually observed in these planes and what we tasked the pilots with trying to fly. So, where we go. This is a more detailed map, and it's slightly difficult. Try to ignore the green line because that's a bit of a distraction. The yellow dots are radar track plots of 175 as it comes in over the Hudson and just before it impacts the South Tower there. So that's the radar track. What you can't tell from this radar track, so it looks like quite a straight line, but you actually have in this last phase here the turn of the aircraft. And I'm going to show you a video clip, and given our tech issues earlier today, that I'm slightly apprehensive, but we'll give it a go. But this should show, the next clip should show 175 in its final seconds before it comes into the tower, and you'll see the maneuver which is being performed. So rapidly dropping down, comes out from behind the cloud, and then it's into a 20-degree bank. And then in the last second, there's a sharper bank. But before that sharper bank, the plane had already effectively lined up with the South Tower. So that's what you got there, a very rapid descent and then a sharp turn to come into the tower. And this image here, a slightly clearer sense of exactly what had to be done to bring the aircraft into line with the tower. This yellow track is 175 before it starts to make a last-minute turn. And it's essentially heading to miss the Twin Towers are up here, and it's going to miss the Twin Towers. And at approximately this point, the aircraft, this is where you see the aircraft in the turn. It's initiated a turn, which takes it, and then this red line here is essentially the final flight track, which takes a plane to impact the South Tower perpendicular with the face of the building. So that's the turn which you saw in the video clip, and that's the turn that the plane's going through. So how did the pilots do? Now, the pilots made multiple attempts at all of the flight routes. We were particularly interested in the first attempt results before they went through a learning process in terms of how to carry out the maneuver. And on the first attempt, we had 2 fails and 1 ambiguous. And I'll come back to the ambiguous in a second, but we had 2 fails. The pilots did not succeed in hitting the tower. And I'm going to show you a couple of clips now. So this is at about 7,000 feet, and it's going to start the dive in. That is the speed alarm you can hear clicking. That means the aircraft's exceeding the V never exceed speed, and the warnings are going off.
Hold up.
Okay, start to turn in now.
Hold up. Hold up. Too low terrain.
This was slightly unclear because there were buildings on the graphics which we couldn't get removed. So I'm going to show the 3D image, which is a little bit clearer, and it's a little bit clearer here that the plane misses the tower. So the pilot started the turn. He's trying to get the plane to turn in, but essentially just misses the tower. This is the second pilot. This is on silent because there's a lot of talk going on and the pilots wanted their identity protected, so it's on silent. But you see a similar process here. Planes put into a dive to try to get to lose the altitude. And then the attempt coming up to make the last minute turn. It's about a mile away from the tower that turn started. And so the turn starts in. You can see the plane starting to turn, but it's not enough and narrowly misses the tower. So just to go through this, what this is indicating is essentially you have a combination of momentum and controllability problems. You have a plane which is going at high speed, 500 knots, it's pulling out of a dive, and then it has to make a turn to pull through 3 or 4 degrees in order to get it to line up with the tower, and it just does not react very quickly. It starts to turn slowly, and it's difficult for the pilots to judge that. Essentially, what you're looking at is you need a lot of precision, very precise timing and judgment. The plane needs to be put into the right level of bank. The control column needs to be pulled back in order to make that turn. And there's not much room for error because the plane is so close to the tower. If it's a couple of seconds too late, then the angle it has to turn through gets greater and greater, and it would become more and more difficult to turn the plane. If insufficient roll is put into the control inputs, then the plane's not going to start to turn fast enough. So you've got to get it just right, or you're going to miss the tower, which is what you just saw with those 2 first attempts. And I'm going to show the result of the ambiguous test, which was, we called it ambiguous because essentially the offset that the pilot flew was far too great, much greater than what you saw on 9/11. So there was never really any hope that he was going to be able to get to the tower. But it does show how difficult it is to maneuver the plane. And we'll just show that now. Okay, start the turn in now. So you can see that he's much more offset to the right. Starts to turn. And you can see his inputs from the control column. He's really having to now pull back and hasn't got any chance of reaching the tower. So it just highlights the problem about the kind of the roll input which is required and so on in order to hit the tower. Some of the flight tests on this, the pilots were lining up basically much too early, so it effectively became a lenient test, and that was much more straightforward to complete. And you could see the pilots wanting to line up early because they knew that you get closer, it's going to become much, much more difficult. So now I want to emphasize, okay, what we're extrapolating from this is that the last minute turn, the stringent test, it's not impossible because on subsequent tests, they were successful once they'd learned what they needed to do. Okay, it's not impossible, but on the first attempt, it was difficult. And it essentially is pointing towards a high difficulty, low probability event for that final maneuver. Let's look at Flight 77, American Airlines to the Pentagon, into the Pentagon. Now here you have the plane. Point of commandeering, according to the official narrative, is around here. Plane turns, heads back, and then, as many of you will be familiar with this, there was a descending 330-degree turn, and the plane lines up into a very straight track towards the Pentagon in this part. And there's an image from the Pentagon shortly after the impact. There's maneuver about 7,000 feet here into the turn, at about 2,000 feet at this point, and then this very straight track towards the Pentagon. A little bit more detail about the flight profile. Again, you know, the stringent test was trying to get the pilots to replicate the actual maneuvers you see on the day to see how difficult these maneuvers actually were. And this is from a 3D modeling study that we have underway regarding what happened at the Pentagon, and this is drawing upon the FDR data, which was released by the US authorities. And this red line is essentially the track in. At this point here, when it's next to the US Naval Annex, is at about, I think, 200 feet above the ground. Descending in, the Pentagon is here. And in this last period here, the plane pulls out of the dive in an orientation which, according to this image, which was released by US authorities, was extremely low to the ground. And it effectively skims across the grass and into the Pentagon. How did the pilots do? First, in terms of the 330 descending turn, we had 1 success and 2 failures. One pilot was completely unable to find the Pentagon after the 330-degree turn. The second pilot did find the Pentagon eventually, but after quite a long meandering sort of tour around to get to attempt to line up, but then was unable to then even line up with the Pentagon. So you essentially had 2 fails to replicate the 330-degree turn. 1 was successful. In terms of replicating that flight path of coming in, pulling out, and going very low across the ground into essentially the lower section of the Pentagon, we had 3 fails on the first attempts. Then power up to 500 knots. And it's not too difficult in a way to imagine what the problems are. You can see the Pentagon here, it's a fairly narrow split. It's a bit like a letterbox that the pilot's aiming for. In this situation, essentially what happens is that the pilot starts to get too low to the ground, is then pulling back, and you get an oscillation developing. And as you'll see in a second, pulling up to miss the ground, and then just goes over the top. So that's one problem. Yep, you're coming in low, and you end up just skimming over the top of the building. This is the other problem, which occurred in one of the attempted approaches. And again, as with 175 in the towers, you know, there's a learning process. On subsequent attempts, started to get better at being able to do it. And here, as you can probably guess, I mean, the angle of descent is slightly steeper here. And the problem at this point is pulling up in time, and it hits the ground before it reaches the Pentagon. So steeper approach, trying to pull out, but not judging it right and hitting the ground. Oops. Okay. So disorientation in the turn, problems of being too high, too low on the first attempts. Again, pointing towards this is a precision maneuver, which requires very good judgment for it to be pulled off successfully. So it points towards a high difficulty, low probability event. There were successes later on, but in first attempts, that's what these initial findings indicate. Now, the lenient test, I'm going to show a run through the lenient test. This is where the pilot was just free to just fly in to the Pentagon as you will. This was actually an attempt which was made after quite a few attempts had already been made. So there is a clear impact on the lower part of the Pentagon. But essentially what this shows is how easy the lenient test, just flying the plane straight in, was, and how obvious that was for a manual control situation. The pilot could just fly it straight in, no need for a descending turn. He could get straight into the Pentagon. I speeded this up. Otherwise it takes a little bit too much time.
Your speed's low, 5 knots.
Okay. So I want to emphasize, as I said I would at the start, that these are initial indications from the stage 1 of the study. We need to refine the test instructions because in some ways the instructions we gave to the pilots possibly made it harder than it should have been. It complicated it and it made it more likely for them to fail. In other ways, some of the instructions actually made it easier, and we need to look at that and recalibrate it. So we need to refine the test instructions. We also need to look at evaluating the simulator. It's a 737 simulator, and there were 757, 767s, and we need to work through issues surrounding the possible limitations and how that might be affecting or the comparability with the actual planes flown. Was the 75 and 767 more or less maneuverable, for example, than the 737? So we need to work through that. But the most important thing we need to do is to get to stage 2 of the study and run these tests with pilots who have experience which is commensurate to the alleged hijackers, people with 200 hours or so of flying experience. And then I think we'll be in a position to sort of make firmer conclusions about the initial indications that we found from stage 1. I would add this is expensive work. We have to hire a simulator to do this. We have to get pilots and we have to put them up in hotels and so on. So we need to get funding to move to stage 2. It is an expensive and time-consuming activity. But, and I'll be on time. Number 1, what are the insights at the moment? So the question of the flyability is more complex than is usually or often presented by people in the 9/11 truth movement who look at this issue. The challenge of flying the plane and hitting the building absent offsets and complicated maneuvers, i.e. the lenient test, is relatively straightforward and doable. I want to make that clear. What is challenging is flying a maneuver actually seen on 9/11, the stringent test, and this is where it gets interesting. The low success rate, this is the bottom line, the low success rate on first attempts indicates that the actual maneuvers were low probability events and would have been especially so for low experienced pilots. Remember, we were using highly experienced pilots. 2 of them were former fast jet pilots. But we need to get that confirmed with stage 2. Third, and in a way this is most interesting, perhaps the most important insight, is that both 175 and 77 could have been flown in a much more direct and straightforward way, less complicated routing than actually occurred. Neither of the routes flown are what you would expect of pilots using what's referred to as Mark 1 eyeball to guide themselves to the target. And the implications of that finding for the issue of manual versus automated control needs evaluating, pointing as they do, essentially, to an automated as opposed to a manual scenario with these flights. And on that note, I'll finish and thank you for your attention.